Happy Tuesday. So we are today with Bethel Eshetu. So in terms of kickoff, we'll start with a bit of background. It'll be lovely to kind of hear more about you, your background, why you're in Dubai today. You were not in Dubai a few years ago. So it's interesting to kind of learn more about that. And then we'll do a bit of a Q&A, and then answer kind of audience questions and so on. So yeah. Okay, perfect. So I think we'll be kicking off just shortly. So welcome everyone. So today we're meeting with Bethel Eshetu, who's joining us from Dubai. So we will be talking about career pivots. That's kind of the big theme of kind of today's discussion. So very much from topics around adaptability, actually kind of reinventing yourself. So going from unexpected kind of territories into new pathways. So I think it's kind of a bit of a commonality that all of us who are from ex-Meta kind of MetaMates kind of share, that the kind of the ability to kind of reinvent yourself and constantly adapt. So we wanted to lean into that in today's discussion with Bethel. And kind of before kicking off, so I'll just introduce myself. So Marilyn Ebony. So I used to work in Meta, and I left the company very recently. And it's been an absolute pleasure to kind of host discussions with Key in recent times, and more recently having a fantastic conversation with Bethel, which kind of inspired lots of further follow-on conversations which led to today. So absolute pleasure to be hosting this conversation, and thank you so much, Bethel and Mariana, for organizing, and Bethel for being our guest today. So over to you, Bethel.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. And yeah, I really love the introduction as well. The one also on your post, whenever I need a boost of self-confidence, that's what I'll read. So I really appreciate you for having me here as well and just being part of this. To give a short intro of what I used to do at Meta, I'm going to start there. I was last at Meta in 2023, July 2023, so a few years, right? So it's been ups and downs, but I'll get to that. But I used to work in ops and market ops and doing on the enforcement side. So the reason why I really wanted to be part of this conversation is, well, my career has been non-linear, but the one thing I would actually think about when I'm in this pivot structure is when I started my career, I was actually trying to follow a blueprint. So I was actually trying to follow something I knew. So I'll just give a bit of a background about myself. I grew up in Ethiopia. My parents both worked in development, so I used to that's the world I come from, and like any African parents, they wanted us to focus on the sciences, be a doctor and all of that, but I actually wanted to do what they did, which is in humanitarian and development sector. And the reason for that is, one, I've seen them, especially my mom, who worked in the humanitarian sector, enjoy the work that she did, but it also afforded a lot of social mobility for us, and just from personal standpoint. So when when my mom's career progressed, I was able to go into international schools, which was disorienting because it was a different socioeconomic interaction. It's not a world that I'm familiar with, but I was also extremely lucky because that allowed me to go to university in the US, where I spent 6 years doing international development focused masters and bachelors. And I came back to Ethiopia with the hopes of following the path that I've seen my parents take. So I started working with a local NGO that focused on monitoring and evaluation. And monitoring and evaluation is essentially like a type of research that you do, or for example, USAID or the EU may have funded a program in Ethiopia in my circumstance. And what the NGO does is work with other international actors to be able to see what that program delivered, and was the funding used appropriately? Did it reach the outcomes it had? So I worked in that space for some time, and I navigated a different opportunity to work outside of Ethiopia, because the one thing about the development sector is your salary range is significantly different when you're a local staff versus you're considered an expat, let's say. Yes. So I went into Zambia. Zambia is where my husband grew up. That's where we met, so felt familiar. And I continued working on the other side of it. So I was in Ethiopia, I was doing more of the evaluation work, which is we're not doing the actual program implementation. But in Zambia, I started working on the program implementation side, working with a community development NGO. So that essentially what that looks like is, for example, the EU wants to fund a program looking at youth and supporting youth in Zambia. And that would be like the focus area of that NGO. So what we did was design a program how we could effectively support youth. For example, on this one we had focused on let's focus on youth in incarceration centers. Let's specifically look at juvenile groups, because maybe the government doesn't have a lot of means to support that particular group. And then we would design that program, what that would look like, which government actors, which NGOs, how would those trainings look like? If should we provide vocational training? What are the resources like? So those type of work that you do involves a lot of interaction with different disciplines as well, because you're not always very informed in, for example, the mental health aspect. So you'll need to talk to people, from that background. You'll need to talk to government agencies around like what type of health facilities they have. So, you have to be quite adaptable to have these conversations, but also simplify it in a way that you can communicate why this is important. So while I was doing this, I had applied to a public policy role at Facebook at the time, now Meta, which I didn't hear back from, but I got a recruiter reached out regarding a market ops role, which was relatively new, and she spoke to me about it. And of course, having no consideration for tech at the time, there's that feeling of like, are you sure? Like this is the like I have not worked in tech, but when I actually got into the role, I understood that there's a lot of similarities in that sense, like the type of structuring that you need to do to be able to understand what are the problems here and how do we have or bring together different people to try to solve it. What are the different skills that you will need to use, or systems and processes that you need to use. And that's how I ended up at Meta. And then through that, I grew in my role. I was first when I started, I was just working on Sub-Saharan Africa, and within 2.5 years, I went on to lead the AMET region, which was interesting because now it's people management and you have a different set of skills that you have to think about. But yeah, I'll pause here.
Yeah, of course, I have a few questions actually on all of this. So I think as well, actually starting kind of backwards. So for those who don't understand what it would look like, so and obviously in a way that's kind of not disclosing anything confidential, would you be able to explain what market ops does? So kind of what is market ops specifically? The team that you joined now.
Sure. So I would speak to my own role, right, at the time. So what we did is measure the quality of enforcement. So like any product and service, when you're on Meta, you are agreeing to the community standards around like what to post, what not to say, and all of that. And there's enforcement processes and tools that have their metrics. And what our team did was actually measure the quality. Were our enforcement decisions correctly made? If they weren't, what happened? What are the improvements that we have to do? And that involves like doing root cause analysis and all of that, and also working with different cross-functional teams.
Yes, and that's obviously in the overall goal of keeping the platform safe, ensuring that people have a positive experience on the different social media platforms more specifically. So thank you for that. I think another question, so kind of moving on. So you've talked about actually, working in Ethiopia and obviously being an Ethiopian national. You've talked about obviously wanting to move and improve obviously your circumstances and how that difference in the development space between local talent having different salaries compared to kind of an expat. That kind of got me thinking. So in relation to that, obviously when you moved to Zambia, you became an expat, I'm assuming, as part of that. So one, how did you navigate that difference? Because obviously you moved to a neighboring kind of African country where others would typically perceive you as a foreigner. How did you navigate that difference? Kind of first, did it feel jarring to do that? And how did it felt on a day-to-day basis? But also, how did you adapt in the context of your work to kind of not let that kind of maybe stop you or kind of in a different way? Yes.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, I was lucky in a sense that I knew Zambia before. It is a place that I've been to, and there's a community that I can reach out to. But in the work context, it had to do a lot of learning around the history. Just like getting you need to do that extra work of what does this mean in this community? What is that? Because for example, in Zambia, there's a lot of chiefdoms, which is a bit different from the Ethiopian context. And when you are especially working in community development, you have to understand that cultural importance. Like you need to talk to the chief or involve community leaders in that sense to be able to have an effective program that people will actually use and will be useful. So that type of learning came from just organic conversations from people at work, learning from like just during lunch, like talk to people, like get to know where they come from, their stories from different regions in Zambia, and also share your own. Because the one thing I found was people were able to explain something in that context when they knew what that kind of scope looked like in Ethiopia. So I would communicate, I would say that, or in Ethiopia this is like that. Is it similar? Or like that's how you kind of form those connections and you begin to like bridge the gap because they also get to know you. It's not like I'm gonna just put the spotlight and like just take. It's also giving of a bit of who you are in that sense. So yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you. I think I'll just welcome. Natalia had to leave, so I was going to kind of just introduce a little bit kind of the next steps. But so we'll continue to do a bit of Q&A, and then we'll open to questions, Daniel. So if you have some questions, kind of keep them in mind, or if you want to drop them maybe in chat, then we'll cover those as well. So another question I had is around more specifically, obviously, between Ethiopia and Zambia, and then I'll talk about obviously when you're doing Meta and kind of your experiences moving to Europe. So what did you feel was similar between Ethiopia and Zambia, and what did you feel were different as experiences?
Yeah. What did I feel was similar was, well, we're both African countries. We have a lot of development problems. There's a lot of similar areas, for example, with women at work, and all of that I think we have a shared experience that you can connect that in terms of the development and type of conversations you have. Like we can relate to that. The difference is, for example, in the historical aspect of it, Ethiopia did not have like a colonial type of background. So just understanding that, I'll give you an example. In Addis, which is the capital of Ethiopia, you have if you have like a big building or a fancy house, and right next to it could be like a shanty type of house, just different. In Zambia, what I noticed immediately was in Lusaka, you have the suburban areas, and then it's like divided, like the shanty areas, and like it's clearly like from a colonial type. And it's like apparent. So those were the differences I noticed, and you get to understand the implications of that. And that's the main difference that I noticed. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, how about when you moved to Ireland and tell us everything? So
it was cold. Get that out the way. But I like cold weather, and for me, Ireland was right after I moved, COVID hit. So I didn't really get to explore the city as much as I wanted to in that first year at least. But it became baptism by fire because all of the business as usual stuff was kind of left to the side, and you had to figure out what that meant. Like people went remote, so the one-on-one type of the in-person interactions were less, and everybody was kind of going through it, understandably. So for me, what was quite different was coming from Africa and working. I've worked with international NGOs and all of that, but the corporate nature of it, I'm talking about the language. You have to kind of reteach yourself or understand like what's between the line, because it's just a different sense of like HR speak. I don't know how to. I think
the business culture
the business culture was quite different. Exactly. So I had to also think about that in terms of the communication and how you come across and all of that. So that was new. So yeah,
that was easy. So how did you navigate that? Because obviously you've spent a number of years working on the African continent and assuming traveling as well. And yes, obviously now you're an adult, while kind of later on in your career, and you have to kind of reinvent yourself in a little bit way. Kind of one in a mega corporation, kind of joining Meta, like kind of huge baptism of fire, right? So kind of traveling, changing continent, kind of weather and so on and everything else, but also the way things move at Meta, which is extremely fast. So kind of how did you have culture shock initially? Because people talk often about like imposter syndrome, joining Meta and so on. So did you have culture shock? Any of some of those other experiences, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah, so I did have a culture shock, and in the short, I did have the imposter syndrome, but I'm grateful it didn't last long. And the reason why it didn't last long is because I had a really great team. They were also from a different parts of the world. And those initial first month, even within COVID, I really wanted to just talk to people. I wanted to get to know people. I wanted to ask them questions about, where were they, what were they doing before? Like, so when I found commonalities, there were people from development, from the humanitarian sector that were in a similar background as I was. So we may not come from the similar countries or region, but we connected in that language, in the development language, and all of that. And I was able to really understand what the team was doing based on advice. And like, advice is, that's something that is free, thankfully. And you kind of like fit to your own context. You kind of know yourself and have that self-awareness to say, okay, I think I'm able to like use. And one of the best advice I got was in that early time at Meta is to really go bold in the type of projects you seek, and that's what I did. And I just challenged myself, because even if you fail, you have a more of a, like, because you're new, you have a bit of like at least you have that as a you're new, so you actually went for it, and it's better to fail that way than like be timid and not try it over. So that helped me. Yeah,
absolutely. Oh, brilliant. So I actually was just going to re-welcome Natalia to the call, and welcome Natalia. So we're just going through kind of host Q&A at the moment, and then we'll open up to audience Q&A as well. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, feel free to either share them in the chat, or if you want to wait and ask them directly to Bethel, then we'll do that. Thank you. And so I think so a few kind of conscious of time. So I think so I had some questions as well, because obviously you stayed in Ireland and then you also moved to London, but I think we'll cover that still with Meta, so we'll cover that a little bit later. But I was interested in now talking about your latest pivot, which is actually kind of moving to Dubai, right? Lots of moving, and kind of considering transitioning to a legal career. So that obviously humanitarian background, working in ops at scale, kind of across billions of individuals, and now transitioning to a career. So I'm curious around, when we were discussing, you were talking about how kind of the Meta background was a bit of a training ground for you in terms of your legal career. So I'm kind of interested in what specific experiences kind of led to you thinking, actually, I want to train in law. Yes.
Yeah, so let me just start by saying I'm very early in my legal pivot. So I'm working on my master's in law, and I'm in this. I just finished the first term on that. And the reason I like this question, because when I'm thinking about the training ground aspect of Meta, I'm thinking about the role I had, which had to do a lot with content policy. And like I mentioned before, when you're the scope of my previous role was looking at enforcement decisions. So like, are you following this policy per per the way it's written? And if it's not, how are we evaluating like the type of language it is? Is it the way the policy is written? So all of it, you can kind of see like how you can structure it using like the law would. But for me, what I found in the training ground aspect of it is just the way you think across those fields. So in ops, there's a lot of structuring, there's a lot of framework, and that's similar in the legal sense. It's not just like legislations, at least so far in my studies, it's not just the legislations and like knowing the rules, but how are you organizing the facts? How are you organizing? Because you can have one rule be applied multiple times and you can have different outcomes, right? So the structuring is very important, and how people use that is also very important. So in any good ops program, it doesn't matter how many systems you build or tools you have or dashboards, if people are not using it and interacting with it in a good way or in a useful way, it's not really going to be beneficial. So the way you think across each one is what is the most engaging part for me.
That makes sense. I also wonder, because obviously you started career in the humanitarian kind of field, and the humanitarian field is actually, I mean, as we can see now, I think, in the broader kind of humanitarian landscape with all the different changes that have happened in the past year, I think it is really strongly underpinned by law, by humanitarian law, and the enforcement of that, and the adherence of states to actually uphold that law is really the foundation of the entire sector. As we've been able to see, where unfortunately in some areas it's been significantly eroded. So do you think there was always that foundation in you, because obviously you've that kind of early background as well, and so that kind of led you to it, or?
Yeah, so so there's a difference between humanitarian and development, right? Humanitarian is more the immediate, and there is like so that's more the human rights, the protection, and armed conflict law. There's a whole litany of that. But in the development side, I would actually say it's more policy driven. So for example, the example I gave earlier with the EU funding regarding youth, it's important to align that with the government's priorities as well. Yes. So if the government is not prioritized maybe this scope in the coming 5 years, how hard is it going to be for you to influence them to now give you the resources? Because you'll need their buy-in to be able to work in the incarceration centers and properly advocate for this program. But yeah, that's the type. So you need to be really in tune with what are the government policies around a certain sector. So yeah, I think in law in general, you have to understand the social contracts in society. You have to have awareness about how to interpret policy. How do you communicate that? How do you influence people? And yeah, just the reasoning, the rationality, the critical thinking, all of that will still apply.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Well, I think,
how do you identify those transferable skills from the fast-paced environment, and how are you able to apply it to other roles? And what are some tips you might have for the people in the audience that are hearing today?
Sure. Yeah. So transferable skills that I see across my experience in development ops and now my early legal area is problem solving. And what that means is structuring, research, critical thinking, the why, like figuring out the why across each bucket. And yeah, those are the transferable skills that I would look into. But also, if you want to pivot into a different area, so for me, I'll get into that bit. But one of the things that I kept thinking about is the areas when looking at my own career is, and now I've done tech, now I've done development, and coming into law is, what does the sector look like down the line? So coming from Africa and the way tech is progressing, the way AI is progressing, one of the things that I notice is there's going to be more and more tech regulations, and specifically in Africa, it's being implemented in a different type of way, right? There's no consistency, and there's also a lot. It's always, tech is going to be a development problem for most of African nations because we haven't maybe digitized everything to be part of this process holistically. So thinking around that and how my skills will move forward with that. So the reason why I was also looking at law is, like, I think for me it was an area, like, even if I had done enforcement and type of work at Meta, it is a gap in if I wanted to go to a regulation, I would be much stronger having the legal background. So that's how I would think about the transferable skills. It really starts with where you are right now. So for me, these were the things that translated, but just considering where your background is, because you can see the dots that connect more than anybody else can. So that's how I would approach it.
Thanks so much.
I actually really resonate with what you've shared, because one of my last roles in that was really in a more kind of regulatory environment. And one interesting learning from that was, the sector has gone from being kind of broadly regulated around security matters, to now having a kind of a more comprehensive look into the way people interact. Kind of there's been obviously a big wave initially around security, then there was a big wave around data privacy, so very much around GDPR and all the regulations around individuals' private information in security matters. I think obviously now we're moving into the integrity aspects, which is very much around people's presence online, kind of the influence on their mental health, the influence in their relationships, in the way they think, and so on. And I think more and more governments are, the future of the technology sector is going to include more regulation at all levels, fundamentally, because governments will be keen to provide a bit more of a blueprint for what good looks like, so to speak, across the board in anything that anyone does. Really kind of getting up to speed on the legal implications of that would be really key. I think it's a little bit like, because I remember I started my career in banking, and banking was quite different before, and then you kind of had 2008, and then there was just a slew of new regulation which completely changed the way the sector operated. So you needed to then really understand, how the regulation impacted what good looked like, and also the influence jobs that the banks will invest in, and so on. So
yeah, 100% agree. And you can kind of see also like having the different languages across the disciplines is also useful, like to be able to work in that or contribute.
No, absolutely. Actually, so I'm actually curious in terms of because obviously we talked about kind of legal and kind of thinking around, kind of moving into that space, and talked about transferable skills. So obviously our sector is going through quite a lot of changes, more generally. So you've had the change in terms of automation, acceleration on that. You've had obviously significant transformation in terms of investment in AI. Kind of lots of regulation coming up and so on. So there's been, I think, easily the past 3 years have been extremely volatile across the sector more generally. So I would say obviously we talked about regulation being kind of a key element, but what would be because obviously you've pivoted. So pivoting for you must have been also with some thinking around the future in terms of what you saw for yourself and so on. So having taken the time to do some of that thinking, what would be some kind of suggestions you would have for people who are doing the same thinking? But for you, you've obviously made that thinking and chosen a particular path. So what would be some kind of challenging questions that you think people should be asking themselves, or things that you think people should be forgetting as they navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. For me, the first things I thought about is what am I actually passionate about? What doesn't feel like when you're working hard, it doesn't really feel like work, right? So what is the type of enjoyment you get? I think it's always good to start there, but there's also practical considerations, right? Like what does the sector of employability, all of that look like? For me, whenever I thought about things as reinventing, it became overwhelming. Just personally, I don't think of it as reinventing. I think of it from I don't abandon whatever I started with. I very much lean on my development education because there's a lot you take from that in terms of like even research and how you present work, and you can always read a comprehensive research paper and find the key points and all of that to connect with. But so for me, whenever you think about reinventing, I would just really think about your strength and start from there and see what your career has given you so far. So for me, coming into Meta and learning a lot about ops, a lot about how tech operates, a lot about the corporate culture, and going from that, what can I take with me? Again, for example, I am going to start a role soon, also in ops. And one of the things that really attracted me about that role is it's a new area, a new team, which they haven't figured out it's quite ambiguous. So that's the challenge that I'm looking forward to. But also that's how I started at Meta. Like the team, SSA was newly launched as a market, and it was a lot of new, there was a lot of new processes that we were building, and that was exciting. So it just reminded me of that link. And I think moving forward, I know there's a lot of specializations and all of that, but I think the more ambiguous problems will still need people, right? So having more skill sets and skill sets that are, you can be successful at. For example, I don't think I'll be a good, like coder and all of that. So I'm not going to pursue that. I'm going to pursue things that more align with my strength. So that's how.
So essentially, it's kind of almost kind of thinking about at the very core of who you are. What are the things that you can do, even at 4 a.m., so to speak? Absolutely exhausted and so on. What are the things that you can excel at, and then finding an organization that has a pain point that matches that problem, so to speak. Would that be how you would describe it? So almost kind of finding a place where what you're very good at is exactly what they're absolutely hungry in this for, no matter where that is, whether it's a small organization or a bigger one or something like that.
What are the type of problems you want to work on? What does that look like? Is it hiring? Is there an opportunity? I think those things are very important. But when the opportunities come, are you ready for them? Right. So the skill sets that you need to work on.
Absolutely. Another one as well, just for you, is and it doesn't have to be perfect, but how do you have any tips, for example, for people who are maybe going through, they've tried, they may be able to say to you, love it, Bethel, but I've tried this a lot of times, right? So, I've kind of done my CV, I've focused on my strengths, I've connected with, 10 other companies and so on, and it's still not working and so on. And they're kind of a little bit exhausted or, kind of a bit tired and so on about, just, they're overwhelmed about that. Would you have it doesn't have to be perfect, but do you have any tips for maybe someone who's going through that? Like maybe some kind of resilience 101, like superpower, that you may have to share?
I've definitely been there. So let's start there. I've definitely been there. Before I got the role I'm going to start soon, one of the key reasons I started law was also looking at, okay, there's this process where I'm just, the job market is crazy right now, and I understand that. So what in that meantime, what is something that I can put my energy towards that will potentially have a good yield down the line? So I didn't want to specialize too much. Like I didn't want to hone in on one area. I wanted something a bit broad, a bit that again I would care about. And that's where I picked law. And I've always had I've always lived adjacent to law. Like my uncle is a judge back home in Ethiopia. So it's something. And my mom dropped out from law school when she had kids. So it's always something in the periphery. But like I told my story earlier, I wanted to follow what they did. But I was finally brave enough to apply and actually pursue it. But in that time, that's what I found is putting in that energy towards something that you're building yourself in that moment, and not as you look for new opportunities. That
makes sense. Thank you for that. Thank you. So I think what we'll do is so we'll probably maybe leave you to kind of share a few final words, and then we'll pause recording, and then we'll just open it for more open Q&A where everyone obviously can participate. So any final words you want to share before we end the recording section of this session?
I would just the only thing I would reemphasize for any pivot or reinvention that I from a personal standpoint, that has worked for me is not to overwhelm yourself, because if you're thinking like you're looking at a blank slate, it becomes overwhelming. But I think just getting the transferable skills and communicating that authentically to where you want to go is always a good starting point than just thinking on starting again. That makes sense. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. Thank you. And if people want to find you, where should they go? If they want to maybe reach out to you after, if they have questions or anything.
I think it's my LinkedIn is on the link, but I'm happy to also share my email if anybody wants to reach out. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's direct people on LinkedIn. So if people want to reach out to you, then they can connect with you on LinkedIn. So yeah.
Sounds good.
Perfect. Well, thank you. So I think we'll close recording here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.